This is the Jeffersonians and the Federalists' Objective 3 about the domestic policies of the James Madison and James Monroe presidencies. And we're going to start here with the fourth president of the United States, James Madison, who was elected in 1808 and served, therefore, from 1809 all the way to 1817 after being re-elected in 1812. Now, Madison had been Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State, and as we've already noted, that's a pretty common theme that we'll see in this class, where a Secretary of State eventually uses it as a stepping stone job to the presidency. But, James Madison didn't really need that on his resume to get the job. Madison was already considered the father of the Constitution, and that in and of itself was a very impressive resume. He was a major contributor at the Constitutional Convention. He had written many of the Federalist Papers, and he had also been the author of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the original Constitution. Madison, in his personality, was a pretty interesting guy. His wife, Dolly Madison, was actually a lot more vibrant than he was and a lot more fun to be around at parties. It's not that Madison was a jerk, it's just that he was a small, bald, weak-voiced guy. He really wasn't a rah-rah type of leader, but he was highly respected for his preparation on all matters and his calm, level-headed intelligence. He had an outstanding career as a lawmaker, but he was just kind of a drab, boring guy. He had a penchant for wearing black all the time, and his wife, Dolly Madison, was again seen as being the fun one of the couple. Now, this objective is basically about Madison's domestic policies, but it's going to be a pretty thin list because his presidency is basically dominated by foreign policy, specifically the War of 1812, and he had trouble controlling Congress in the meantime. So he only has a couple of major domestic policies. The first one was Macons Bill No. 2, which was introduced in 1810. It was meant to replace the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. Now remember, the Non-Intercourse Act had said that we were going to maintain an embargo with Britain and France and not sell any goods there, but we would sell with the rest of the world. Well, Macons Bill No. 2 asked either Britain or France to eliminate their trade restrictions against us. Whomever did so first would get trade with the United States, and whomever did not would still have an embargo on them. Madison absolutely hated the idea. He felt like it was begging Britain or France to trade with us, and he left the decision of who it would be to them. Eventually, France was the one who agreed to trade with the United States, kind of, and the embargo on Britain continued. The second one was the Tariff of 1816, which eventually helped establish the quote-unquote American system that we're going to study in later lessons. Now, let's do a quick review of how tariffs work. If a foreign nation, again, I'll use this example, like England, wants to sell its products here, a tariff means that they're going to have to pay a tax to the United States to be allowed to sell their products here. Now, if those tariffs are pretty low, it's not that big a deal to England or any other country that's trying to sell their goods here. But the Tariff of 1816 was one of America's first truly protective tariffs. It increased the price of tariffs by 20 to 25%. Now, if a foreign nation is trying to sell their products here, they're going to have to pay a pretty hefty amount just to get their product in the country and try to sell it. That tariff is now part of their production costs. You've got to account for that when you're spending money to produce the product, and therefore the only way to make a profit on that product is to significantly raise the price of it. Now, according to the law of demand, if that price goes up too high, they're not going to buy the foreign product. They'd rather buy the lower-priced domestic product. And so when you're raising rates extremely high on your tariffs, you're basically sending the message that you're trying to make it a little more impossible for foreign nations to sell their products here and make it easier for American businesses to sell theirs here instead. It's now a protective tariff designed to protect American business because you're making it much more difficult for foreign nations to sell here, and making it much easier for American consumers to choose the lower-priced American items. And if the foreign country decides they do want to sell here, they're going to have to pay that hefty price, and the U.S. government is going to get paid. Okay, so moving on to President number 5, James Monroe, who was also elected to 2 terms and served from 1817 to 1825 after getting elected in 1816 and 1820. The most significant thing about James Monroe as a president is that he's the last of the quote-unquote founding brothers to be president of the United States. We're talking about the guys here who were involved with creating the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and setting up the original government. James Monroe was in that crew, but he's the last of the founding fathers or the founding brothers to be president of the United States. He did, however, continue the quote-unquote Virginia dynasty that had existed in the presidency. Washington, Jefferson, and Madison had all been presidents from Virginia. He does have one other cool thing, though. He's the only president to have a foreign city named after him, Monrovia in northern Africa. I still don't know how or why that happened, but it's a pretty cool thing for James Monroe. Here it is today, as you see in the slide. He's basically less distinguished than the 4 presidents who had come before him, and was never considered a brilliant or a great president, but not bad either. Monroe won the election of 1816 by a pretty hefty amount in the Electoral College, 183 to 34 over Rufus King, who was the last of the Federalist Party candidates. The Federalists, remember, had all but died out after this election. Now, Monroe's personality was fairly tame. He was a tall, mild-mannered gentleman, not really daring or flashy in any way. And he was generally very well liked. His presidency is known as the quote-unquote era of good feelings, after he did a goodwill tour around America to inspect the military pretty much immediately after he got elected. But what about his domestic policies during the era of good feelings from 1817 to 1825 when Monroe was president? Well, again, the domestic policy aspects are a little bit thin. There's the Panic of 1819, which was created by land speculation and wildcat banks giving out reckless loans. He really didn't have any policy for that. It just kind of happened. Also was the Land Act of 1820, which authorized people to buy 80 acres of land for $1.25 an acre. That was pretty significant. But Monroe's major domestic policy during this time was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Now, this was promoted by Henry Clay of Kentucky, and it was fairly controversial. The Missouri Compromise said that Missouri could be admitted to the Union as a slave state in 1821. But it also said that Maine, therefore, had to be admitted as a free state, which actually had happened a year before in 1820. The idea was that if you're going to add a slave state to Congress, you got to add a free state as well, so that nobody gets a distinct advantage in the slavery issue, which as early as the 1820s was already starting to become a bit of a hot button. What it basically said in the Missouri Compromise, outside of the Missouri and Maine thing, was this, and this might have been the most significant part. See this line here? This is line of latitude 36 degrees by 30, and it said all territories above the Missouri Compromise line, 36 degrees 30 latitude, could not have slaves, except for Missouri. It was a pretty unique compromise to make at that time. But while James Monroe's domestic policies outside of the Missouri Compromise were a little bit thin, there was a lot of judicial activism that took place during the era of good feelings, or in other words, the Monroe presidency. And it was led, of course, by the ghost of the Federalists, John Marshall. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court continued to be dominated by Marshall long after Marbury versus Madison in 1803, which gave the court the power of judicial review. Now, Marbury versus Madison had happened a long time before, again in 1803, but during the Monroe presidency, the court case McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819 would become historically significant. This case would increase the power of the federal level of government at the expense of the states, which was a very federalist policy, a very federalist way of thinking, and something that the ghost of the Federalists, John Marshall, was more than willing to do as the Federalist policies and the Federal Party was starting to lose steam and basically fall out of existence. Marshall, as the ghost of the Federalists, was still looking for ways to create federal laws or increase the power of the federal government. And McCulloch versus Maryland definitely did that. Here's what basically happened. The state of Maryland attempted to destroy a branch of the Bank of the United States by imposing a tax on its currency. Now, Marshall declared that Maryland had absolutely no right to destroy that branch of the Bank of the United States. It was, quote-unquote, necessary and proper for it to be there. Remember Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 of the U.S. Constitution? That had already been established that a Bank of the United States was necessary and proper, even though Hamilton had stretched that a little bit, as you remember. But the bottom line was Hamilton was a Federalist, and so was Marshall, so Marshall was completely willing to protect the Bank of the United States and say that Maryland had no right to destroy it. He also said that Maryland had no right to tax a federal bank. Essentially, what was established in McCulloch versus Maryland by the Federalist John Marshall was that the federal government has power over the states. And that case, McCulloch versus Maryland, set that precedent for generations to come that the federal government does have power over the states and can step in. It was a huge, monumental court decision that would have ramifications for decades afterward. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.